wanted to work with my people. I wanted to treat my people. I wanted them to be able to see me on somebody's directory and say and read what I had going on and see like, okay, that looked like somebody that I can learn from or I can relate to or that's gonna understand me. And that's what's driven me to be in mental health in general. Is like I want to normalize therapy and mental health and the fact that like we are not alone in our struggles and it's okay to talk about
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Legacy Speaks podcast. My name is Sierra Hillsman. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I'm the CEO of Legacy Speaks. And you know, I love having conversations with fellow clinicians, entrepreneurs, and creators. And today we have the amazing Brittany Rogers. She hails all the way from Chicago, Illinois. And I'm super excited to have this conversation because y'all know I love talking to fellow clinicians of color. And so we're going to talk a little bit about her practice, her journey, as well as the book that she has. So Brittany, welcome to the podcast. Let the people know who you are and everything all about in relation to your business.
Hello. Thanks for having me. So I'm Brittany Rogers. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor. I'm a certified alcohol and drug counselor. I'm a life coach and I'm also an author. Pretty much, let's see, I do private practice, which is one entity, and then I have my own business, which is Be the Change Therapeutic Services, where I pretty much allow myself to use my skills in a bunch of other areas like coaching, like speaking engagements and podcasts and things of that nature, consultations, couples mediation, co-parenting mediation, workshops, group work, that sort of thing. And then I also have my book, which is The Things I Wish I Knew, a Millennial's Guide to Learning the Mental and Emotional Concepts that the school system and our parents didn't teach us. I'm really proud of it. My goal with the book was to pretty much highlight what I believe to be the most foundational concepts that we need as millennials and as generations coming up under us to change generational cycles, to start our own healing, and also as just a therapeutic resource for people who may be skeptical about therapy, who may not be ready to go just yet, or who are in therapy and trying to further their own knowledge outside of session. And so I wrote it so that it can be completely relatable and digestible to where we are today. And yeah, it's my baby. What else do I do? I also do YouTube. I'm a content creator. My YouTube channel is Keeping It a Buck with B, and that features a bunch of different content focused on mental health, emotional wellness, dating, relationships, sex. I do personal vlogs. I kind of tell my own personal stories on the channel. And so that pretty much rounds me about out.
Oh, love everything about it. So we're going to dive right in. And obviously we are millennials, and it's a beautiful thing to be able to be of service to fellow millennials. What made you choose that specific demographic, and what experience, strength, and hope can you provide to other individuals who are starting their therapeutic journey?
I really enjoy working with millennials just because obviously I relate the most to them. And I feel like we are just like change makers as far as the generations go. Like we were the first to really bring like mental health therapy, self-care to social media and to start to like normalize it and encourage, leaving certain habits and patterns and behaviors in the past with older generations, and then trying to do things differently so that we can be better parents, we can be better siblings and teachers, and really kind of just bridge the gap in between that younger generation who I feel like we're starting to see from them, like there's the what is it, Gen Z? Yes, yeah. Gen Z, like they're really shaking stuff up. I'll say that. But one thing that I'm seeing that makes millennials so special is we have this balance of understanding and taking the really good traditions and practices that we grew up with, as far as like responsibility and hustle and respect and discipline and commitment, And we're taking those really good things from the generations before us while also understanding that certain things need to change. Whereas you see with Gen Z, from my own experience with working with some of them, and then the generations that are coming under them, the younger ones, and just working with like high school students. I'm gonna say sometimes they could be a bit entitled. They want things handed to them on a silver platter. And so millennials, we kind of understand like the balance of like, yeah, I want to pursue my dreams and I know I have the capacity to do that, but I also know like I may need to work my 9 to 5 to be able to make those things happen. I may not be able to abandon everything and just be comfortable living in my parents' crib. Like I still want things that, I can say I accomplished on my own. And so, of course, there are anomalies and outliers in every generation, but I feel like as a collective, we are doing a really good job of just trying to be better, and take the things that we need and leave the things that we don't.
Yes, definitely. I think that's the beautiful thing about our generation. We have the opportunity to look back at the traditions and the wherewithals from our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents and figure out ways to make them as applicable as possible. But we're also learning how to redefine larger concepts like joy, happiness, success, fulfillment, all of those things. And we've become a lot bolder when it comes to expressing our needs, which also inspires the generation after us. And so for the clients that you work with who are probably already starting therapy, what are some common themes or maybe even areas of focus that you typically see within this particular population? And how do you help your clients navigate through these?
So what's interesting is I have my clientele is mixed, right? Like as far as ages. So I have people that are in their 50s, in their 40s, in their 30s. I have some teenagers, I have some college students. And so kind of across the board, when it comes to certain difficulties I'm seeing is like things that are related to like family dynamics, right? So being able to figure out like how do we deal with the people in our lives who refuse to change, right? Who necessarily, control their behavior, but they may be difficult to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so this is where like we're doing a lot of talk these days around boundaries. Boundaries is another like huge word that's been seen across social media, like self-care, and how we execute those boundaries to be able to protect ourselves, but also sometimes still maintain relationships with people who deep down we love, but we may not be able to tolerate all the time. So that's one area. And I would also say the workforce. I feel like a lot of people are in this conflicted place of trying to just find their way, and not get stuck and not get stagnant, but also dealing with the systemic factors that sometimes can hold us back from being able to really reach the heights that we want to, and having to get creative, whether that be switching jobs, whether that be branching out into entrepreneurship, or doing the work to gain new skills. And so I think that family and work are probably the biggest pieces that I see from most people as far as like where they're struggling at and what they want to improve upon.
Right, because those are two dynamics that we often find ourselves rooting our identities in, especially when it comes to family. Depending on what type of family you come from, you're either the caretaker or the caregiver, or maybe the baby of the family that's been enabled, or maybe even the person who has been parentified in nature. On the flip side, you have your job dynamics where you were instilled with these practices of like, go get a job that's going to leverage your degree and have a 401k and benefits and things of that nature, and grind. And so kind of going back to what we talked about is just learning to explore those different aspects and seeing how we can cultivate a better sense of self as we are moving in these multiple environments.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is definitely it can be difficult, as well as we're also in a time where we're seeing a lot of, unfortunately, like misinformation about mental health online, because it's becoming trendy. I always say like mental health has become trendy all of a sudden, where we have TikToks where people are self-diagnosing. And so sometimes that is also making the counseling field a little bit more complicated because you have people that come in who feel like they have something, and it's like, as the professional, I'm telling you that I may not think that's what that is, but we have social media playing a huge role in a lot of what we're seeing as far as like even self-esteem issues, confidence issues, and just this idea of like, what your life should look like, or luxury, and how that's being praised now. And so it can be difficult as a therapist to keep up with the trends, and also try to educate people against maybe some of the miseducation that we're seeing on social media.
Yes, girl, please don't get me started. I think it's very interesting because we're both in the entrepreneurial space. I remember this speaker at a conference I went to. They were saying like self-help books are a catch-22. On the one end, you get an opportunity to learn more about yourself in relation to the content. On the other hand, you start to read so many self-help books that you start to think that you have some type of disorder or maybe an issue in relation to you and your business or your passions or your endeavors, when in fact, the book was created from a general perspective, even though it's very niche in nature. But it's kind of like going to a meeting, especially within the substance abuse space. You go to a meeting, you take what you can get, you apply it, you leave the rest and keep it moving, and you live just for today. And so I think about that all the time when it comes to seeing your content scrolling up and down. Like, figure out what is for you, use it as a point of reference, but not as something to define yourself or to create like a label for yourself.
This year has been a whirlwind, hasn't it? And I'm pretty sure that you and your business have had to make a number of changes as a result of the pandemic. But I need you to get really present right now. Let's tap into the here and now in this very moment. When was the last time you truly checked in on your team? As a matter of fact, when was the last time that you truly thought about how you and your team are mentally and emotionally navigating through all of the adjustments that are taking place? But guess what? I'm here to help with that. Hi, my name is Sierra Hillsman, and I'm a licensed professional counselor and certified clinical trauma professional. I work with small businesses and corporations by helping their teams explore their presenting concerns. That way we can increase employee engagement and improve productivity overall. This can be done through in-person or online lunch and learn events, corporate workshops, and organizational seminars. Click the link below. That way you can start to learn how to truly invest in the overall mental and emotional wellness of your team.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I often tell my clients too, I don't talk much about diagnosing. And I know some therapists, they may like sit down and discuss the whole diagnosis piece, but I personally think that I more so focus on symptoms, because those are the things that we're looking to improve or to treat or to decrease, versus like, oh, if I tell you that, I think you have generalized anxiety disorder, and then now you're online looking up every little bit of thing that they speak on about it. And it's like, well, I actually like just needed to give you something because of insurance. Like, you may not even fully meet the criteria, or that may change, over the next year that I see you. And so, I try not to get people to get stuck in those labels, because regardless, you still have to function as an individual and thrive as your best self in this world. So the label at this point doesn't matter. How do we make you better? How do we help your experience in life improve at the end of the day?
Yes, definitely. Using that information as a point of reference and not rooting your identity in that particular diagnosis. Because like you mentioned, at the end of the day, the work still has to get done. So whether you call it a cat or a cow, it still needs to be done.
Exactly. And so many things overlap, where it's like, I tell people all the time, like, mental health and psychology is not an exact science, so you may appear this way one day, and then on another day you appear this way. And so we kind of just have to work with what shows up, and use, the knowledge and the education of our programs and of our experience to be able to help you in the best way possible.
Let's talk about the education piece, because I feel like that's so important. A lot of people sleep on psychoeducation. And I know usually people come to therapy to unpack their trauma or their presenting concerns. But I was talking to a friend about this before. You can also go to therapy for skills building and to cultivate new ways of approaching a particular set of circumstances. So how do you approach psychoeducation, and what specific themes do you work on with your clients?
So typically I see a lot of anxiety and depression related symptoms. Those are the most common things that we see. And then occasionally maybe some, especially in the private practice space, maybe I may have a client who was previously diagnosed with like bipolar. And so we may work through some, again, some more manic or depressive symptoms. But I'm big on being able to provide resources where you can read about it that I've particularly chosen. So that way I know, that this is on the money. This is what you need to know about it.
Yes.
But also, like you said, that skill building, right? Being able to walk you through, what meditation looks like, certain things that are related to like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and or DBT, which is something that I learned a lot about at my last job, and I pulled pieces from them because I find them really useful. And so that's also a big reason why I wrote my book, because I wanted to be able to provide a resource of content and skill building that was written by somebody who is a professional in this field. One of the chapters in my book is on coping skills. And a lot of the work that we do is on coping with hating your job, coping with not liking your family, coping with maybe not liking your circumstances. You know what I mean? Life is full of a lot of coping, and we either develop unhealthy coping skills from a young age, and then that kind of further progresses into things that become a problem, whether they be substance abuse, whether they be misusing, like overusing sex, those alcohol, all of those different types of things, gambling, but also being able to come to a space where somebody can give you some ideas. A huge thing that I also see is a lot of people don't realize the correlation between, when we leave school and then we become adults and we're out on our own, is the loss of structure. So I talk to people a lot about like adding structure to their lives, because they're just waking up every day, kind of going with the flow and wondering why they feel stuck, wondering why they feel stagnant, wondering why their goals aren't coming into fruition. And so a lot of what I do is we end up working backwards. Like, what are some of these things that, another good way to put it, as far as like working backwards, is the things that we've left behind in our childhood or in our adolescence that we enjoyed, that were great coping skills, but we moved on to other things, whether that be coloring, writing, reading, games, So I do a lot of reconnecting people with the things that help them be somewhat successful, whether that be as a student or in their childhood, to have more fulfillment that they've left, that they now need to learn how to reincorporate. So I think that those are some of the things that I see I work with people the most on, is like, how do we get you on a schedule, right? Like, when we were kids, we knew wake up at this time, school at this time, extracurriculars at this time. And so, and then you have those kids who didn't have much structure because maybe their family or their parents weren't involved the way that they needed to be. And so they're at a place now where they've carried those things and they're trying to figure out, like, why do I feel so all over the place? Usually that's a piece that's missing.
Oh, Brittany, you are on fire, girl. You better go. Yes, getting back to the basics. I think in adulthood, we feel like, okay, I'm grown.
I can do whatever. Yeah, I can stay up 2 in the morning, and you wonder why you tired and you can't focus. You eating chips for breakfast, like that ain't never served us.
Right. I've matured past coloring. Girl, if you don't get these Crayolas, okay, and this book, and get to drawing, do what you got to do. That's so important. And you talked about how a number of your interventions came from your experience through private practice. A number of individuals may not be familiar with the different settings within the mental health field, right? So I've worked in various settings: hospital, agency, you also have residential, inpatient, outpatient, partial hospitalization, whatever the case may be. But please let people know a little bit about your journey into private practice.
Yeah. So, like you said, I've pretty much worked at every level of care at this point. To break it down for the audience, you could think of it as like a tier system based on like severity, right? So, you have your inpatient, which is really people end up there when they are in some form of crisis and needing stability. So you may have your nurses who can help you, whether it be with a substance abuse problem or self-harm or suicidal thoughts. You know, that's usually where inpatient comes in, when you may be harm to yourself or somebody else, and you're not functioning at any sort of level where the lower levels of care would be sufficient for you, right? And then residential is maybe kind of on the same playing field or a little lower, where you really need more long-term treatment. So I've done residential treatment centers. My first job was, I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and there was a residential center out there that I worked at. And that was my first job in mental health, my senior year. And I worked full time, and it was a huge learning experience. I mainly worked with like DCFS wards of the state. And so the nice thing about residential as a counselor or as somebody who works in mental health is being able to really build bonds with the people that you work with, because they're there for extended periods of time. Whereas like inpatient, you know, you may be there for a week, you may be there for 2 weeks. 3 weeks, you're kind of pushing it, you know, depending on your insurance, if they keep you or not. But you don't typically see people past maybe a few weeks. And so I did, like I said, I started in residential. They also had a psych hospital out there. So I started, you know, I would pick up some shifts every now and again on different floors in the psych hospital. And then when I moved back to Chicago, I worked at another psych hospital called Chicago Lake Shore. And baby, you see a little bit of everything at Chicago Lake Shore. Like, you know, the people that sometimes you may see like tweaking downtown, or like the homeless folks, and you don't know what's going on and they acting bizarre. Those are the type of people that end up at Chicago Lake Shore, you know, that the police end up having to bring in, or, you know, crisis centers send people there when they're really struggling. And again, they need that stabilization. So I worked there for a few months when I started my grad school program. And I didn't stay there long, just because me being in grad school and working in mental health, it was a lot for me, because I was also dealing with my own personal issues. Some of that ended up being mental health related. And that's actually when I started my own therapy. So I didn't stay there long, but again, it was a good learning experience. And I came to decide that like, I'm going to be working in mental health for the rest of my life. I'm going to school and I'm learning about it. I want to do something different. So for a while, I worked at daycares. Like I have another history as far as employment with working with children. And so I did that throughout grad school. And then right after that, when I finally graduated, I got a job at another hospital, more of an inpatient setting, but I worked specifically in their substance abuse program. And I will say, I really do enjoy working with the substance abuse population. I have family members who are in recovery. And so I've grown up knowing about like 12-step programs, which is like your AA, your NA. And so it was really good for me to be able to expand my knowledge in that, and be able to work with people in the community who were struggling in that way. And so I worked there for, you know, I think maybe about a year. It was cool. And then that's when I transitioned into what's called a partial hospitalization program. And the we call it for short PHP, but the PHP program I was working at also had a residential component to it. So people would go to, it was an all women's treatment center. They would go, you know, women would go to the residential center and then usually step down and then come to our PHP program. And that was a journey in itself. It was a huge learning opportunity. And I really did take a lot from my experience working there. But what I will say is we were talking about how I got into private practice. And what ended up happening was after being there for maybe about a year and a half, almost 2 years, right before the pandemic happened in February of 2020, I ended up getting fired. I've never been fired from a job. People don't talk about getting fired. That's one thing I realized when I went through that. It's like nobody talks about this part of working, and it isn't fun. But pretty much I was wrongfully terminated. It was definitely some racial issues that had been tied into their decision to let me go. It was a predominantly white population I was serving, and it was also a predominantly white population in which I was working with. And, being a young Black girl telling adult white women what they can and cannot do, as far as abiding by certain treatment guidelines and all of that, it didn't always go over well. And, I think one of the things that I relate to Black women the most on is just the struggle of being able to just show up and do your job sometimes in certain spaces and environments. Like, I wasn't trying to hurt anybody or, do anything wrong, but just the fact that, setting boundaries, giving directives, as a Black woman, it isn't received well in certain environments, and it's difficult to uphold the responsibilities of your job, because when I was working there, I wasn't in this therapist role. I was more so in a, what do we want to call it, like a direct care role, where yes, I did some therapy, but I also was responsible for these clients, like day-to-day movement, you know what I mean? Making sure they went where they needed to go. I did a lot of group work, and it just became, the company in itself was having difficulty retaining people. They had some bad media stuff going on, so it was already kind of going left, and I was trying to get up out of there. I had a plan in place, and baby, they fired me, and that was actually the best thing that ever happened to me, because obviously it was right before the pandemic, a month before everything shut down, and had I still been there, I would have been a first line worker. I forget the term that we're using for it, but I would have had to work through the whole pandemic.
Yeah, an essential worker. Yeah,
I would have been an essential worker. And actually, maybe 6 months prior, my aunt, she had a friend who was a therapist and had been in the business for over 10 years and had her own private practice. And so I kind of mentioned to her, because in my mind, like, I felt like I didn't want to do private practice until later in life, like I felt like it would be too boring for me. I was used to working in all of these settings where you just never knew what was going to happen, and you never knew what you were going to walk into. And so a part of that is like exciting a little bit, and it keeps things interesting. So I was like, yeah, maybe I'll do private practice later, especially when you weigh out, the pros and the cons of like, that 9 to 5, you're going to get your benefits, you're going to get your PTO, your sick time, your insurance. And private practice doesn't really, unless you work for a really well-established group practice, you're not going to get those types of benefits. And so I'm big on like security and stability. So I was like, yeah, I don't plan on doing that. But the people that I was working with at the time, a lot of them were doing private practice on the side, and eventually left that company to do it full time. So I kind of learned more about like the experience, the pay, the flexibility. So it started to become more appealing to me. So yeah, like I said, I must have ran into my aunt, and I'm telling her like, yeah, I think I kind of want to try it. And she's like, oh, I got a friend, blah, blah, blah. So she hooks us up. Her friend is like, I'd love to bring you on and, get you, working kind of part-time. So I had already been doing that before I had got fired. And so once I got fired, and I had already had this plan in my mind, by the time things really started going south, that I'm like, I'm not doing these company politics anymore. Get me out of here. I'm going where the money resides. Okay. Like, the private practice. And I've just always been somebody like, I like to make my own schedule. I like that flexibility and being able to kind of just have more control over what my job looked like and my clients and, the input. Because if you work for any company, regardless of the field, that there are politics, that there are people at the tippity top that are making the decisions, and they aren't even the people that are doing the direct work, whether it be with clients or just producing, like they're not even the ones that are doing those things. They're just calling the shots. And after a while, it started to get frustrating, and me getting fired was kind of like the nail in the coffin. So after that happened, like I said, the Black woman that I work for, she has just been amazing. She knew, she never second guessed what happened or me as a clinician. And she said, we're gonna run it up. We're gonna get you these clients, you know what I mean? And she was already overbooked. So she was more than happy to bring me on board and start flooding me with people. And it's worked out ever since then.
Girl, oh my goodness. Thank you so much for your honesty and transparency with the journey, because I don't think people understand the journey of a licensed professional counselor or a mental health professional. All they think about is, you sit in the office all day with a nice little sofa and you take your little notes. And it's just like, listen, do not try my license. Okay, it's hours upon hours of graduate work. Then you got postgraduate work. Then you got CEUs that we got to attend to, all these conferences and stuff like that. It's just so much. And I'm pretty sure there's somebody out here who's listening who is probably interested in diving into the mental health field, but they feel like they only have to choose one particular setting. And so for anybody who is experiencing that, know that when you get into this field, you can do so much. And as a matter of fact, you may not even want to actually do therapy. You might want to start off in the place of doing research, or maybe even policy making, advocating for the mental health field on behalf of other clinicians, or you can do consulting, working with different companies. So even if you go on to get your license, you do not have to feel like you have to be a slave to working these particular jobs. I think that's so important, because I know for me, in my experience, as I was bouncing around, I too said, I don't know if I want to be in private practice. I don't want to feel isolated. I love working in those types of settings where it's just like, to be honest, in the hospital, anything could pop off. You never know. In residential, anything could pop off. It's never the same thing over and over. And sometimes you can kind of get into a routine with private practice. But honestly, private practice is where the money resides. And if you want to do that and do something else, feel free to do it. Know yourself and know what you want your career to look like in the long term. And the beautiful thing is you can always pivot. And I think that's something that we as millennials, we've mastered the art of pivoting. If we don't like something, deuces, let's try something different. So thank you so much for being an example and just letting us in onto your journey.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think that's another reason where my business came into play, because I knew, like, even if I do private practice, I want to start to develop something that is my own. And I knew that while private practice may be my bread and butter, I need to shake stuff up. I want to be able to speak and spread knowledge, and not only do that on a one-on-one basis. One thing my last 9 to 5 did teach me is the fact that, like, I love group work. Like, so I love being able to sit with a bunch of people and discuss concepts and, get people to look within and, do worksheets and just be able to, like, expand knowledge on these topics. And so I think that is one thing that I would tell anybody, is to just really start to harness your skills with maybe that grudge work that you have to do when you first get out of school. I've done some, lately it seems like grad counseling programs are requiring that students interview a licensed clinician at first year. And so I've done a bunch of these at this time. I wish they were making us do that when I was in school, but one of the questions I get the most often is like, what advice do you give to, like, clinicians in training? And the first thing is, like, to let folks know that first job out of grad school, you probably won't like it. Like, that's just kind of the honest truth. It might be your first 2 jobs, those first 2 years where you're really trying to find your footing, you're really trying to apply what you've been learning, and you're picking up new skills. And if you've ever worked in mental health settings, they kind of, like, a lot of places don't give you a lot of training. They just kind of throw you to the wolves, because usually they understaffed and they need you to hit the ground running. So you going in there like, I don't know what I'm doing. I think a lot of imposter syndrome in those first 2 years. But there's so much to be gained. Like, a lot of my material I got from those places. I have big binders full of, like, worksheets and pamphlets and packets that I built, because I was like, when I leave here, I'm taking all of these resources with me. But yeah, I think it's always just important to figure out what you're good at and where your lane is, because I didn't even think I would put out a book. And it was at that last job where I kind of became inspired with that group work that I was doing. I'm like, I'm teaching people stuff that you shouldn't have to come to treatment to learn. Like everybody should be able to have access to this information and learn how it applies to their life. And so that was really like the seed that was planted that brought my book to life, because if I hadn't have been there, I probably wouldn't have had that revelation. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have had that content that I was introduced to, that I learned more about. And I came to understand that like I had a gift in storytelling. Like a lot of what I was doing in groups is I'm taking this content and I'm not just regurgitating it. I'm pairing it with stuff from my own life so people can really understand what it looks like what that growth looks like, how understanding, how your anxiety manifests itself in real life versus like, oh, well, you may do this or you may do this. No, I'm telling you that before I got a handle on my anxiety, I used to blow men's phones up because I didn't understand why they was ignoring me. And it took me to learn about attachment styles and anxiety skills to get better at that. So I realized like, this is what I'm good at. Like, I know how to take these concepts and to make them relatable and understandable to people. And if I can continue to do that on a larger scale, then there is no limits on where my career can take me.
That is so true. Honestly, that's really the premise behind Legacy Speaks, taking larger concepts and breaking them down to make them more palatable. Because I think oftentimes we forget as a culture that therapy is not a luxury. It's accessible to anybody who wants to pursue it. Granted, there are some barriers to treatment, and we definitely understand that. But one thing that I learned when working in the hospital setting is that people who are not people of color, regardless of what socioeconomic status they were in, they were willing to pursue services. They were willing to walk into a hospital and say, hey, I got this issue. And they were willing to pursue services. I think for us, especially with it being Black History Month, we struggle with all of the stigmas in relation to mental health. We still continue to struggle with the concept of vulnerability and letting people in and letting people help us. And so I really appreciate you as another female woman of color who is actually being the change out here, because it's very important. People want to see what mental health looks like from a practical perspective. They want to be able to relate. And I think that's the thing that sets us apart as these new age, because, new age clinicians, new age therapists. It's important for people to see what therapy looks like instead of what they've heard that it looks like. So shout out to you for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Definitely.
Like you said, one of the things that we're doing as a community is trying to get Black people to see the value in therapy, in addition to, like you said, removing these stigmas that exist as far as like, well, you don't talk to people outside of the household about your business, and you don't tell people stuff. And, we're just so worried about being judged. And I love the fact that another reason why I went into private practice is because after like 2 years of working with majority white people, I wanted to work with my people. I wanted to treat my people. I wanted them to be able to see me on somebody's directory and read what I had going on and see like, okay, that looked like somebody that I can learn from, or I can relate to, or that's going to understand me. And that's what's driven me to be in mental health in general, is like, I want to normalize therapy and mental health, and the fact that like, we are not alone in our struggles, and it's okay to talk about it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Brittany, this final question I always ask my guests, and you kind of touched on it a bit, but the podcast is called Legacy Speaks Podcast. And so when we think about legacy, or when you think about the concept of legacy, what would you like your legacy to say about you?
Oh man, that's a deep question. I guess I want my legacy to speak to like just changing the face of what we've associated with mental health and therapy for so long. Like, I enjoy the fact that, my clients, they come to session, they don't know what my hair is going to look like, like they don't know what I'm going to pull off on that day,
Yes.
And one of the things, like, I work with a non-for-profit in Chicago called Coffee, Hip Hop, and Mental Health. And the founder, Christopher Lamarck, when we first started working together, he used to just always tell me that he enjoyed me because I felt like a homegirl. Like, I felt like the girl from up the street around the corner. And I think as a professional and as a clinician, you come in or you finish school and you want to fit this mold that is so traditional and kind of outdated. And I want my legacy to say that I did this being myself, like being authentic. And people wanted to work with me because of that. Like, I never had to be somebody that I wasn't. And I was able to really embrace all the good and the bad that I've had to deal with to get to this point. And knowing that, like, I did stuff for the culture. Like, I tell people all the time, that book, like, my book is for the culture. My YouTube channel is for the culture. I want people to know that, like, these resources exist, and they exist from people who understand you, who look like you, and who relate to you.
Definitely. Absolutely. Love it. And even when you were talking about that, I was thinking about something my former clinical supervisor told me about private practice. The difference between the private practice setting and like any other setting is the fact that your clients choose you. When you are in the hospital setting, when you're in residential or in agency, those clients are filtered to you without anybody thinking about your expertise or your experience. Those clients are passed on to you based upon a number and what time they entered into the program. But with private practice, it's a lot more intentional. These individuals go to a directory or they hear word of mouth, they see you on social media, and they choose you and they pick up the phone intentionally to work with you. So thank you, Brittany, for all of your gems and your wisdom. Please remind the people where they can find you, how they can tap into your book, and where they can find Be the Change Therapeutic Services.
Yes, so we have my business Instagram, which is another resource where I put out a bunch of mental health related content. That's at Be the Change TS on Instagram. And then we have my website, which is where you can find my book. You can also find the book through the link on that Instagram. The website is www.bethenchangets.org.
Awesome sauce. Once again, y'all, please make sure you're tapping into Brittany Rogers. And if you are in the state of Illinois looking for a clinician, make sure y'all hit her up. All right. Just slide into, no, I wouldn't say slide into the DMs, but slide into her inquiry. Okay.
Yeah, hit the email.
Hit the email. Okay. Because I do not like them DMs via social media, but please make sure that you're reaching out to her. And once again, my name is Sierra Hillsman, licensed professional counselor and the founder of Legacy Speaks podcast. Please stay connected via Legacy SPKS on everything. And please make sure that you are going over to our website at legacyspks.com. Until next time.